Is my okay? Fine. So in today's class, what we shall see is that we shall start with Unit 4, that is associative models. So basically, I would continue with the fact that what neural networks could be used for. We have seen what the neural networks could be used for, and we saw that it can be used for classification, clustering, and so many other things. It can be used for vector quantization, it can be used for regression, and so many other things. So today we shall see how the neural network can be used for association. So unit 4 basically deals with association and associative models. So first, let us have a look at what is the meaning of association. What is meant by association? So association is a task of mapping patterns to patterns. So as simple as association, it means that, supposing if at all you see somebody, or if at all you look outside, okay, you see there is a tree, and you are looking at the tree only, you can identify it whether it is a mango tree or it is the coconut tree or it is something like that, or whether it is a what kind of a tree it is, you can identify, because so it is stored in your mind basically. So basically association is a task of mapping patterns to the patterns which are basically already stored in our mind. So an associative memory is the one in which the stimulus of an incomplete or corrupted pattern leads to the response of the stored pattern that corresponds in some manner to the input pattern. Say, so what basically it happens in case of an associative memory is that stimulus, what is the meaning of stimulus? Stimulus meaning input. So whenever I provide an input of an incomplete or a corrupted pattern, I should be able to get the response. Okay, I should be able to get the response of the stored pattern. Okay, so what is the meaning of this is that supposing now you read this. Okay, now can you read this? What is this? Anybody can tell me what is this? Yes, unmute yourself and you can tell me what is this.
You can read this.
You can read this. So basically, these words which are there, they are incorrectly spelled. All the words are incorrectly spelled, and but still your brain is able to recognize this. Yes or no? Your brain is able to recognize the words, and the brain is able to recognize the phrase which is made, because even sometimes whenever the spelling mistakes are made, your brain is able to identify that there is a spelling mistake. It doesn't have to compare one by one, and it can auto correct it, and then you can identify. So basically, even if at all you have given a corrupted or an incomplete pattern, it leads to some particular pattern, okay, which is stored. So in our brain the correct spellings are stored, meaning we know the correct words. YUO is not a correct word, it is YOU. Similarly, CAN is the correct word. So basically association is basically either you can, here in this case, whenever an input is given, you are trying to associate with something which is stored in your brain. So despite the fact that the words were wrongly spelled here, our brain was able to retrieve the correct word in response to the associated. Okay, so in response to the associated in the correctly spelled word. So basically, from the wrongly spelled words, we were able to retrieve the correctly spelled words. Is that clear? Now, now is this possible with the computer memory? It is not possible with the computer memory. It is possible with the human memory. So in the computer memory, what we know is that if at all you remember computer memory, what happens is that we do not, we have the memory addresses, right? We have a memory, we have a memory. You may have known this in while studying any subject. You have a memory, and you have some memory addresses which are there. and at that particular memory address you will be storing some data, right? So basically the first memory location what is stored, the second memory location what is stored, third memory location, like that we have the computer memory. And whenever I want to read from a particular location, I have to go to that address and I have to read it. But this is not the case in case of a human memory. A human brain memory which is there, it will be stored in the form of interconnections between various neurons. So even if at all there is a mistake in a particular word, it will not say that it is something wrong which is not stored. Okay, but our human brain can still identify, because there are many interconnections between the neurons, it can still identify, the errors, and it can try to map it to the correct things. So in associative memory, basically our memory, human beings memory, is like associative memory, because it will be trying not only to, say for example, if at all you see a person 10 years back, and 10 years later also if at all you see the person, you will still be able to identify. Okay, even if at all that person has grown old, you will be able to identify, because it is not like that our memory will take a picture of that person and store it in a memory, and then whenever you see that person, try to map it pixel by pixel. That is what is not happening here. But our brain tries to see the different features on that particular person's face, and those are stored, and based upon those features it will be able to identify that particular person, and not pixel by pixel comparison. So even if at all the certain features of that person have changed, like that person has got mustaches after 10 years, or have got a thick beard or whatever, or some pimples or whatever, still you will be able to identify that particular person. So the same type of memory, we are trying to use it in a neural network. And whenever the neural network is going to play the role of the associative memory, what is basically done here is that the data is collectively stored. You can see data is collectively stored in the form of a memory or weight matrix. Data is collectively stored in the form of a memory or a weight matrix. Now, usually, basically, what happens is that you are not going to get, you are not going to get, you have seen that, how we get the weight matrix. And this weight matrix is considered like the memory. So, and basically, whenever we have the weight memory, whenever we want to find the output, we have to multiply the input with the weight memory. So that is usually what is done in the case of neural network. How we find the output? Why? Output Y we find by taking the product of the input and the weights, W transpose into X. So similarly here also we would be doing the same thing. But here the weight matrix will be the memory. So basically you can see here that there are some patterns which will be presented here. Okay, if at all you see, there will be some patterns which will be presented here, and you can see here this is the input. Okay, you cannot see the cursor. Okay, you can see here. 1 minute. So what you can see here, this is an auto-associative memory. I will tell you what is auto-association and hetero-association later. But in this case, you can see here there is some memory in which it is storing some patterns. So how many patterns are stored here? There are two types of patterns which are stored here. One is yellow triangle and blue square. So now what I am giving is that I am going to present a particular distorted pattern. And looking at this now, although it looks like a triangle, but it is not a triangle because the color is blue. So actually it is a square, but it is distorted. So even if at all you give the distorted figure, it will be able to identify, and this will be declared as that it is a square pattern because of the color. So now there are two processes which are involved here. One is the process of learning. So what is the process of learning? Whatever samples you want to store in the memory, all these samples, whatever now you have stored here, two different samples. Once you have stored a triangle yellow color and blue color square. So those two will be presented, and accordingly I will adjust the weights of this auto associative memory here. Okay, this is memory. So whenever I'm presenting the input and updating the weights of the memory, it is called as learning or storing the desired patterns in the memory. So this is called as learning. And the second step is that it is called as recall. Now what is the meaning of recall or retrieval? The process of recall or retrieval means that you are presenting some pattern. It may be a corrupt pattern, or it may be a proper pattern, it may be a distorted pattern, any pattern you can give, and based upon that I am trying to recall or retrieve the perfect pattern from the memory. So this is what is called as recall. So if at all we go in for that example of the English alphabets, it would look like earlier we would be training the neural network by all the correctly spelled alphabets. So that would be the weight updation or the learning. And then whenever I give the incorrectly spelled alphabets and I try to recall which is the correctly spelled alphabet corresponding to that incorrectly spelled alphabet, that is called as recall or retrieval. Is that clear? Now, so coming to the two types of the pattern association task. So basically what happens is that I have already told you that pattern association is a task performed by neural networks in which whenever you present an input sample, it should trigger a specific output pattern. So you give a particular input and you will be getting a particular output. Say for example, in that English spell checker, if at all you see you give YUO, it has to give you the output as YOU, which is the correctly spelled word. So the input will be the misspelled or the wrongly spelled word, and the output would be the correctly spelled word. So basically in auto association, what happens is that whenever you give a particular input, it should generate a particular output. Now there are two types of association tasks. One is auto association and second is hetero association. So let us first have a look at an auto association task. So both the input and the output vectors have the same vector space. Now what does it mean? The inputs, whenever we are giving the input which are trained, that is the same as the output. Say for example, while training a neural network, now say for example this. Now this is a network which is storing three different shapes, that is a triangle, a circle and a square. So how will you be training this particular model, auto association model, is that first you will give a triangle, then you will give a circle, and then you will give a square, and the weights would be updated. Fine. So this is called as the learning phase. And secondly, in the recall phase, what you would do, you would be giving a triangle, and when it sees the triangle, it will try to map the triangle, and the output produced will also be a triangle. Whenever you give a circle, it will produce a circle at the output. Whenever you give a square, it will produce a square at the output. So basically both the input and the output vector spaces are the same. You give a square at the input, you get a square at the output. You give a triangle at the input, you get a triangle at the output. You give a circle at the input, you get a circle at the output. Then why we are doing this? Because our main aim is to have the distorted figures. So I am storing the main figures in the memory, and then I give the distorted figures. So I give a distorted square. And when I give a distorted square, I should get a proper square. When I give a distorted triangle, I should get a proper triangle. So this is what it means when I mean to say that both the input and output vector spaces will be the same. But what happens in the input pattern is that the input pattern is a corrupted pattern. So basically it is used to, auto association tasks are basically used to convert the corrupted input patterns into the proper stored input patterns. Is that clear? Now, one more example of auto association task which is said here is a spelling checker. So, what is the meaning of a spelling checker? So, a spell checker will possibly maps the incorrectly spelled words to the correctly spelled words in the same language. So, basically, the previous example which I took, I said you can read this. Okay, it was all the 4 words were misspelled. So, in that particular model, I will be having in the memory all the correctly spelled alphabets, and then it will try to check which are the words which are miscorrectly spelled and modify those words and tell you the properly spelled word. So that is the task of auto association. Fine. Then we move to the hetero association task. So in the hetero association task, what we can see is that there will be two different vector spaces. So the input vectors are mapped to the output vectors that range over a different vector space. So the vector spaces are not the same. So as you can see in this particular figure here, a triangle in the input space is mapped to a circle in the output space. A square in the input space is mapped to a rhomboid in the output space, and a cross, okay, an X in the input space is mapped to a figure of 8 pattern in the output space. So as in the auto association task, there were only 3 patterns, input and output. It was the same thing. So basically what will happen here, if at all a triangle is given at the input, what should happen at the output? A circle should be displayed at the output. If at all a square is given at the input, I should get a rhomboid at the output. Okay, and if at all I give an X pattern at the input, I should be getting at the output figure of 8 pattern. So this is what is the meaning of hetero association task, wherein the input pattern and the output pattern both will be different. Okay, in auto association what happens is that both will be in the same vector space, whereas here they will not be in the same vector space. Now example, if at all I give to you here, I have given one example here. Okay, and you can see here how the whenever you give the distorted square also, what happens when you give the distorted square, you are getting, it is correctly first it is correctly detecting that it is not a distorted square but it is a square, and after it maps that, it will be mapping the square to the rhomboid and the answer will be a rhomboid. So in both the cases you can give the distorted input patterns as well. Now one more thing is that hetero association, you need not always give a distorted pattern, but you can give a proper pattern as well. Okay, say for example I have given English to Spanish translation system. So the input patterns will be in English and the output patterns will be in Spanish. So basically a translation system is a hetero association task because both the vector spaces will be different. Okay, input vector space will consist of all English words and output vector space will be consisting of all Spanish words. Okay, so in auto association the input sample is presumed to be corrupted, noisy, or the partial version of the desired output pattern. Okay, because if it is not corrupted and not noisy, then why do we need auto association? We already know what is the pattern, right? So most of the times the input sample will be corrupted version of the output pattern. So in auto association basically what happens is that it stores a set of the patterns. and if the pattern is similar to the set of the stored members, it may associate it with the input which is closest. Say for example, now I have a distorted square here. Okay, you can see a distorted square here. This is a distorted square, and how many options are there? I have a triangle, I have a circle, and I have a square. So I can either map it to a triangle, circle, or a square. But what happens is that it has got more similarity with a square, and that is the reason I am going to map it to a square. So this is called as auto association task. So basically, an auto associative task is the generation of the complete image such as a face from a corrupted version. So I may have a particular corrupted version of the face of a particular person, and then looking at that corrupted version only, I can store the or I can retrieve the actual face which is stored in the memory. So then similarly, distorted alphabets or square helps in recalling the alphabet or the square which is stored or encoded. So here it is identifying a distorted square. Similarly, you can have distorted alphabets. Okay, so this auto association is very helpful in for character recognition. See, because each person writes the different alphabets in different ways. So I write A. Somebody's A will be a bigger one. Somebody's A will be a smaller one. Somebody's will be tilted. A will be. So the way you write A, B, C, D, even if at all they are in all capital, each person will write in a different way. So the pattern space is the same. The input patterns are also alphabets. Output patterns are also alphabets. But each person's patterns are slightly different from the ones which are actually stored in the memory. So or character recognition is an auto association task. Now see here what happened. This is a distorted pattern which has appeared. So this distorted pattern, after using auto association, I am going to map it through a correctly stored number which is number 3. Fine. Now moving to hetero association. What happens in hetero association? The output pattern may be any arbitrary pattern that is to be associated with a set of the input patterns. So basically here there is a sort of an association between the pairs which are stored. Now one example which is given of hetero association is that generation of the name when the image of the face is presented as the input. So what I told you previously, whenever the face is presented, a distorted face is presented, the actual face will get displayed. But in this case, what happens is that it is one step more. The faces of the different people are identified and already a name is given to them and they are stored in the memory. So whenever that particular person's face will be identified, it will be mapping it with his name, his or her name, and then the name would be displayed. Now say for example here, this already I had taken in the previous slide, wherein the triangle is mapped to the circle, the square is mapped to the rhomboid, and the X pattern is mapped to the figure of 8 pattern. So this is called as the association. There is already an association between the pairs of the patterns which are stored. So depending upon that, the output. So whenever a square input pattern is presented, although it may be a distorted pattern also, still I would be getting the rhomboid. I will not be getting a distorted rhomboid. I will be getting a proper rhomboid, because the distorted square pattern, it gets first mapped to the square pattern, and then the square pattern get mapped to the rhomboid because of the hetero association part. Fine. Now one more example is that there can be a neural network which can be designed to have, supposing it says Niagara, the output will be waterfall. Supposing, like for example, it will give you what it is. Say for example, I say Kolva, it will say Kolva beach or something like that. If at all I say Dudhsagar, it will tell me it is a waterfall. So basically these are some spots which are there, which are the very famous spots. If at all you give, okay, if at all you give the spots, okay, and different landmarks, such as there are different beaches, there are waterfalls, there are cliffs, okay. So you can give the names and then according to the name it will try to tell you whether it is a waterfall, whether it is a beach, whether it is a cliff, what it is. You can have a neural network for that as well. Fine. So we have discussed here auto association, hetero association tasks, and in unit 4 you have this different types of auto association and hetero association algorithms. So in the next class we shall go into the details and the problems of each of those. So I will stop now.